Now, your electrifying hosts of Exploring the Bizarre, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
Tim! Oh my gosh, you're really making a racket with that lawnmower. It's 6 o'clock in the morning. We're guests of our friends here in Australia. Did they ask you to help them out?
But no. I'm trying to see if I can duplicate one of their saucer nests. The saucer nests were an early version of the crop circle phenomena.
Rather crude ones, I would say, but did they get their point across? Do you really think that they were made by an alien intelligence?
I'm not an expert, but our guest tonight from the other side of the world is. It's something I hope we can get some answers to.
I would hope so, as you're really making quite a racket here. You might wake the kangaroos up. We don't want that to happen. Let's get back to the KCOR radio studio where we can do our research in peace and harmony.
All right, this is Exploring the Bizarre. I'm Tim Swartz. I'm starting the show right now because Tim Beckley's having a little problem getting online, but we should have him hopefully later on in the program. But we'll just get right into it then and introduce our guest, Cheryl Gotshall. Now, Cheryl is a return visitor to our show, and just really absolutely happy to have her with us. Now, Cheryl was born in Brisbane, Australia, but at an early age lived on a cattle station in country Queensland, where as a child she often looked at the stars like a lot of us and wondered if there was other life out there in the universe. Now, in her teenage years, she developed an interest in the paranormal, and in 1988, she became an active UFO investigator for the Brisbane-based organization UFO Research Queensland, and has since held 2 terms as president for a total of 24 years. So soon after joining the UFO RQ, Cheryl had her own close encounter with the commonly described gray alien appearing to her in her home, and this was followed by the development of a serious 10-year illness, during which time she experienced a near-death experience, out-of-body experiences, and other mystical, paranormal, and psychic phenomena. Her quest for what was happening to her led her on the path to shamanism and the understanding that these events were an invitation, but more importantly, an initiation into other realms populated by a variety of beings. Her personal experiences catapulted her into the world of shamanism, and which she now uses and teaches shamanic practices. Now, in 1992, Cheryl also established the first close encounter support group in Brisbane after Bud Hopkins spoke for the first time at a conference there. So now, while working as a dedicated researcher of the UFO mystery for 31 years, Cheryl organizes and speaks at monthly UFO meetings for UFO Research Queensland, and in addition, she is a member of the International Association for Near-Death Studies and hosts monthly meetings and explores the afterlife. Now, Cheryl is a regular writer for the Australian bi-monthly publication, UFO Encounter. I think that it's probably the last remaining English-written UFO magazine out there, and also the UFO Truth magazine, published in the UK. UFO Truth magazine, is that still being published, Cheryl?
Yes, it is. Yeah, but I'm no longer writing purely because I just don't have the time, basically.
Yeah, I can understand that. Well, Cheryl, thank you for being with us. It's always great to have you on Exploring the Bizarre.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate being asked back.
Oh yeah, no problem. Well, and I hope that you're doing well. I mean, I know that the huge fires that they were having there in Australia were not close to you, but people see that in the news, and they're like, oh my gosh, is that anywhere near you?
Yes, I know what you mean, but there was still plenty of smoke to go around.
Oh yeah, I know. It's like here in the Midwest, we get a lot of thunderstorms and tornadoes, and I'll have people who will say like, oh my gosh, I saw there was a tornado in New Mexico. Are you all right? I live in Indiana, so
Gosh.
that's quite a ways away. All right, so hopefully Tim Beckley, he's writing, asking where everybody is. So I don't know if I think that Tina's trying to work it to get him online. But let's start, Cheryl. Now I know that Tim really wanted to talk about the famous, or possibly the infamous Tully UFO nest. That's something that has fascinated him for a long time. So why don't you let our audience know just a little bit about what the Tully UFO nests were?
Sure. Well, I guess there were a whole lot of incidents that occurred around the time in 1966, but this was one that really grabs people's attention. It occurred in Tully on the 19th of January in 1966, and it was at 9 a.m. Mm-hmm. And what happened, and Tully, let me just explain, Tully is 1,500 kilometres north of where I am in Brisbane, and that's about an 18-hour drive on the roads up north. So it's in far north Queensland and in a very tropical zone. But the actual incident, which, by the way, I have to say also, I'd like to give some credit to a UFO researcher who's now passed on. Her name was Claire Noble. And Claire also went on to help one of the witnesses collect more information and document further source and nests that were found on his property. But this actually started with a gentleman called George Pedley, and he was a banana farmer at a place called Uramo near the town of Tully. And so at 9 a.m. on that day, he was driving his tractor across the property of his neighbour's cane farm, and his neighbour was called Albert Panisi. Anyway, the farm track ran alongside a location known as Horseshoe Lagoon, and it was called that due to the shape of the lagoon. Anyway, the lagoon covered about a half an acre. I think that's about 2,000 square metres. It was almost dry 3 months of the year on a regular basis. It had little or no bird life around it. Maybe an ibis or two was seen here or there. But anyway, in the December, the month before, they'd had good rain. So by January, when the main incident occurred, the lagoon was half filled, maybe 30 metres across at its widest point. Anyway, the greater part of the lagoon was covered with a thick growth of water reeds whose stems were about half an inch, and they protruded above the water to an average height of about 2 feet. So you've got this big open area, a watery lagoon, and reeds protruding out of the top of it. And the entire lagoon was green and lush until the day of that incident. So what happened was George was driving his tractor as he approached the lagoon, and he heard a noise. So he leaned forward in his seat to listen, and he thought the motor was misfiring. Anyway, and he almost immediately heard a hissing sound. So he's got his head down listening to this. So he initially thought, a tyre was punctured and it was leaking air. But then, to his astonishment, he saw a large saucer-shaped rise from the lagoon. And George was facing the object with his back to the sun. So he had a clear, unimpeded view of it. Nothing was shining, no sun was shining his eyes, nothing was being misinterpreted. He was getting a good, close, clear view of what he was seeing. And this saucer-shaped object moved directly upwards for approximately 60 feet. It tilted slightly, and then it veered off in the southwest at a really great speed. Now, the entire event only took about 4 to 5 seconds, but if you count out 5 seconds and imagine this object rising up in front of you to about 60 feet, tilting slightly and then just taking off, you can still imagine that you can really eyeball what you're seeing in front of you, because when you're seeing something spectacular like that, your mind is taking in a lot more information than it ordinarily would, because this is something so vastly unusual, you know. Anyway, George estimated the distance of the object from him. It was only about 22 metres. So he got a good look at it, and he described it as about 25 feet in diameter, about 9 feet thick in the centre, silvery grey, and had a really sharp outline. So he jumps from his tractor, runs across to the lagoon, and pushing his way through 6 to 7 foot tall swordgrass on the lagoon's edge. And he immediately sees in the middle of the reeds a large circular area devoid of reeds. And then he further saw, near the edge of the still slowly swirling water, a patch of giant water couch grass. And people might not be aware of this. There was about a square yard of which had apparently been clipped short, and the clippings were removed. Anyway, he returns to his tractor and he restarts the motor, and he goes on his way. Then later that morning, he came back past the lagoon, and on further inspection, he sees for the first time the floating mass of reeds now on the surface of the lagoon. And the reeds were radially distributed in a noticeably anti-clockwise manner, like the crop circles that you were used to hearing about in the UK.
Right.
And the reeds in the nest, as it had come to be called, which what they got called here in Queensland anyway, they were still green, just like the other reeds in the lagoon. And after the object had risen, the reeds were still green, but when George returned in the afternoon, they appeared to be dry and browned off, which is really interesting because it was only about like 12 hours later and they'd completely died off. Anyway, so by this time, George thinks, well, I better tell someone else what's going on here. So, I mean, I think I would have told him a bit earlier. So he goes off to alert the property owner, Albert Panisi. So mid-afternoon, they both returned to the lagoon, which, by the way, was about 1.25 miles from the Panisi house. Anyway, Albert decides to swim around the lagoon, and he discovers that he can swim underneath the massive reeds since they are no longer attached to the bottom of the lagoon. And he finds that the water is quite clear. Anyway, the mat of reeds is now floating on the water's surface, and that mat is about 18 inches thick. Now, the other thing that some people may not be aware of is that when they inspected the surrounding area, they found markings leading from the lagoon to the loose ploughed soil in the adjoining paddock. And these were described as being about 3 to 4 inches long and approximately 2 inches across at the widest point. And they were spaced about 12 inches apart and in a direct line as if one's walking, you know, one immediately behind the other. So anyway, samples of the reeds from both inside and outside of the nest were taken, and they were sent to the University of Queensland in Brisbane to check for radiation. They all proved negative except for one exception, which was the sample taken from the centre of the nest that showed a small increase in the beta range, but it was so small it was only equivalent to 1% of the reading taken from a dial on a wristwatch. So it's, you know, that could be easily explained by a variation in the normal background radiation. Who knows, really? But they thought there was nothing there that was outstanding. So anyway, they had further tests, and this is where it gets a bit interesting because they wanted to determine why the reeds had rapidly browned off within a 12-hour period. And the results were that the reeds died from natural processes, probably hastened by submersion due to flooding. But there'd be no flooding, you see. So anyway, whoever was doing the samples, they dumped them in the bin after that. But there was no explanation given as to why all the other reeds in the lagoon remained green and healthy. So the people from my organisation, UFO Research Queensland, which in those days was called the Queensland Flying Saucer Research Bureau, they decided to do their own tests, and they asked Albert to take water from the lagoon, add a quantity of fresh green reeds, complete with roots, and completely submerge them in a large drum. And then the drum was then left standing on the banks of the lagoon in full sunlight, and they examined it daily. It was 3 full days before the first signs of browning became evident, and 7 days passed before the decaying process became obvious. So it seems that those reeds that had browned off so quickly had done so in response to something. Even though the test at the University of Queensland said, they basically discarded it and said, oh, it's just natural, just died because they were submersed in flooded water, which there was, which didn't happen to the rest of the reeds.
Right.
So unfortunately for Albert, like his farm was completely overrun by the public and other people wanting to come and investigate.
You could tell from the newspaper. You could tell from the newspaper cuttings.
Yes,
which I've
absolutely.
Seen all over. Now I missed the first few minutes of the show. Were there? I remember when this case broke, but were there any UFO sightings associated with this nest?
Yes, well, that's where Albert actually saw a UFO rising from above where the nest was, and tilting slightly and flying off at a fast speed. But his wasn't the only case, but I can tell you a bit more about that in a minute. But
yes,
the other interesting part of this was that after the media had published the first lot of botanical findings, the RAAF claimed to have also done testing, and they'd found similar results, with the addition that the nest could have been caused by so-called whirlywinds. Well, it wasn't, obviously. So the main incident happened on the Wednesday. The following Monday, the RAAF makes the statement that the nest was most possibly caused by a hovering RAAF helicopter. But then the following day, the RAAF states there are no Air Force helicopters in the area. So they weren't getting their story straight, basically.
Usual cover-up.
The usual cover-up, but there's much more cover-up that went on with this case because of the increase in activity in Queensland at the time, the UFO Research Queensland decided to place 2 magnetic monitoring devices fitted with cameras in 2 locations in Queensland, and one of them was at Tully near the lagoon. So apparently what happened was that device was triggered. It registered that it had recorded something. It was posted to Kodak in Melbourne, that film. 14 days later, the sender received a letter from Kodak stating that the film case had arrived, but it was empty.
Oh, boy.
So, we've heard that before. And there's other cases, many other cases like that of missing films and photos. And I've just got a couple here that I've gathered. In 1953, 9 photos were taken at Port Moresby of a UFO. This is in Papua New Guinea, of a UFO. The photographer was Mr. Drury, and some people might know this as the Drury film. It was a very senior official of the Civil Aviation Department, and the 5 best shots that he took were lost by the authorities, lost in inverted commas. Then in 1954, 200 photos were taken with both film and still cameras by 3 young men who were driving near the West and South Australian border and were paced for 45 minutes by a UFO. They used all the film they had with 5 cameras. The film was borrowed again in inverted commas, by the RAAF, and of course they were never returned. And there's two other cases. One in 1961, a UFO was observed in brilliant sunshine by scores of North Queenslanders and photographed by a journalist from the Cairns Post newspaper. So he said a 5x3 negative was sent to Kodak of Melbourne by a senior astronomer who he sent it to, from the Mount Stromlo Observatory in Canberra. And not surprisingly, they denied ever receiving it too.
Of course.
Yeah. And then in the last case, it was in 1965, several photographs were taken by a pilot from the Ansett airline over Bougainville Reef in the Solomon Sea en route to Port Moresby from Townsville, which is in Queensland. His aircraft was being paced by a UFO. On returning to Townsville, the pilot was met on arrival and flown directly to Canberra with his camera and the aircraft's black box. The radio man at the Townsville airport was transferred to Darwin the following week, but I can't find any documentation stating what happened to the pilot after that. But anyway, these are some examples of not only the Tully film, but also other, it was common practice in those days for photographs and films to be, taken and not returned so that the RAAF could analyse, to see what was going on for themselves.
Well, we had a famous case here, Rex Heflin, who was I think a county worker doing some survey work or doing some road work, and he took a series of photographs in California. And Tim, didn't the photographs disappear for, a decade or more, and they finally ended up in Ann Druffel's, I think, a mailbox 15 years later?
Right, yeah. At least 20 years they disappeared.
Yeah, at least 20 years they disappeared, yeah.
But there's a bit more of a story to the Tully case, because there was another thing that happened on the 8th of February 1969 when this device that had been set up to be able to monitor, anything that was going on in the area. It had been set up in Albert's son's bedroom. I'm guessing it was because it was the best location to face that particular area. I'm not really sure why. It's not quite clear in our records. But anyway, Albert's son, Shane, he was woken by the UFO monitoring device, which had a buzzer. And he turned it off thinking to tell his father about it at breakfast, but Albert had already gone out the house earlier. And Shane forgot to tell him until he came home. And anyway, so as soon as he found out, Albert gets in his tractor and drives out to the lagoon and discovers a new saucer nest. Now, this one was 29.5 feet in diameter and perfectly circular. There were also reeds floating on the surface, again in a clockwise direction. And on further inspection, another smaller nest was discovered at the extreme north end of the lagoon, and that was 12 feet in diameter. And it had all the characteristics of the larger one. So, and then about 25 feet away from the new nest and about 15 feet above ground level, there's a protruding branch of a tree. And this branch has an area of leaves about 6 feet long, about 2 feet deep, and they're scorched. And the leaves are crisp and they're curled up, showing signs of browning. There were no tracks to or from the tree. So more testing was carried out by the University of Queensland once again, which concluded that due to the nature of the specimens tested, that wasn't carried out on that tree. It was on the samples from the nest, the second nest. They said that the nature of the specimens tested, it would have been expected that they would still be green and alive, but nearly all of the specimens were dead and starting to decompose. So, it was just a whole lot of things didn't add up properly. There was, there was things going on in the area. It wasn't the only case. Things went on just prior and for a while after. And I remember Claire, before she passed, some years back actually, she told me that, she'd collected well over 100 cases from the Tully area of these nests that had been found on the ground. And
all right, Cheryl, let me interrupt you here because we have to go to our bottom of the hour break. When we come back, we will continue our conversation with Cheryl Gotshall on Exploring the Bizarre. So stay tuned for more.
Now back to Exploring the Bizarre with two of the most electrifying researchers in the paranormal. Your hosts, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
All right. Welcome back to Exploring the Bizarre. Our guest tonight is Cheryl Gotshall and Tim Beckley. I'm glad to see that you were able to get your internet problems solved. And
well, I tell you, it's been a difficult 3 or 4 days. I haven't even been able to eat much in the way of food. Actually, it's not too good.
You don't have the coronavirus, do you?
Oh, I'm so old, Tim. I think I might have the swine flu.
No! Oh, yeah. All right. So, Tim, do you want to carry on with the conversation here?
Carry on. Carry on. Yeah. Well, Cheryl, they seem that UFOs. They seem to be interested in the floral makeup of Earth. Maybe they're checking for radioactivity in the atmosphere or something. But you've got cases there in Australia where these things have come and apparently even come down and landed in the tip top of trees or pretty darn close to it.
Yeah. I do think that they are definitely interested in our flora and fauna. I have had people tell me that they've seen in the distance UFOs, and this is up in North Queensland again. One case was where it was on the ground and these small beings were sort of walking around. He was quite frightened. He was off in the bush. I think he was treating noxious weeds or something at the time, and he was watching them. And they did seem to be collecting things off the ground. And I mean, we've heard that worldwide. That's nothing new. That I remember there's a case in the United States in Canada actually in the 1930s where they were seen to be doing this sort of thing too. So I'm sure that they would come here and just like we would. If we were on another planet, we'd be picking up samples to analyse and test and see what use we could make of them too, I suppose.
Well, I know one of the first cases that Bud Hopkins, the late abduction researcher, investigated was the case over in New Jersey where this fellow on the way home from work happened to see a UFO across from the Stonehenge apartment building, if that isn't a synchronicity. It was a craft that had landed, had a couple of tripod landing gear. A couple of aliens came out and seemed to be scooping up the soil before they disappeared. And Tim, in your incredible Alien Encounters book, we talk about a case, I think it's right there in your home state of Indiana, where a young fellow saw and photographed an object that landed in a tree in his yard or his neighbor's yard.
Yeah, it didn't land in the trees. And this was in 1967 in Milan, Indiana, where this UFO, which looked like an old-fashioned cow milk jug, was floating past his bedroom window, kind of like above and through the trees. And the odd thing about it, and he did manage to take a couple of color 35 millimeter photographs. But the odd thing about it was that the next day, a lot of branches of these trees that this thing came close to had withered and died. So I mean, very similar to what had happened to the reeds there in Tully.
For sure. I wanted to change the subject a little bit here. What is with mysterious pregnancies?
Missing pregnancies.
Missing pregnancies. Okay.
Missing pregnancy cases. Yeah. Yeah, I've heard a few of those over the years, and not just in Australia, but all around the world, actually. And there was a case here that involved a woman that I've known for quite a long time, and she was working at on the Gold Coast, and there was sort of like a lead up to this. Okay, it's not just suddenly you're pregnant and then you're not, and there's a whole story around it. But just to keep it as brief as I can, What happened leading up to this experience was that she was driving the same way to and from work every day. And that particular night, she left work around 7 p.m. and she was walking across the car park towards her car when she saw the brightest star she had ever seen. Anyway, it was so bright and beautiful, she couldn't take her eyes off it. And for some really weird reason, she suddenly became very emotional and she started to cry. Anyway, she quickly got into a car. She could see about 5 other people in the car park who also saw this bright light or star, and they were commenting on its brightness as well. Anyway, she drove out of the car park, began a journey home. The next thing she remembers is pulling over to the side of the road, feeling very disoriented and wondering where the heck she was and how she got there. It took her minutes to get her bearings. Then she drove home, annoyed with herself for driving in such a confused and irresponsible manner, she thought. Anyway, she arrives home. She's still quite emotional. She walks inside. Husband wants to know where she was because she was over an hour and a half late. So she's running around checking the clocks going, oh, my gosh, like that can't be right. I've only just left work and it takes me so long to get home. I can't be an hour and a half late, but turns out she was. But this was just sort of like the beginning of what was going on for her. Because after that, they decided to go on a holiday, and they were going to go up to North Queensland or central North Queensland to do some fossicking. Anyway, before she went, though, she found that now let me get my story straight here. She discovered that she was pregnant. That's right. She already had 2 children, but she really wanted to have this baby, but she had concerns that something didn't feel right. She had a terrible feeling that she was going to lose this baby. But anyway, about 2 weeks later, she develops gynecological problems, thinks she's going to lose the baby. According to the doctor, everything was all right, and she was about 6 weeks pregnant. So they decided to go off on this fossicking holiday. And so she started to have some more problems where she thought she might, she was starting to have a bit of spotting. She thought she might have a miscarriage or something. Anyway, but she kept that to herself because she really wanted to go on this holiday. I don't know if I would have done that, but anyway. So they took off, stayed in a motel. They were heading towards Cairns in North Queensland, far North Queensland, when her husband strangely decides to take a detour west, and they arrive at a place called Sapphire. It's about 4:30 in the afternoon. Now, this is in 1988, mind you. So as they're driving around looking for somewhere to stay, the husband turns down a dirt road and he quite suddenly, with no warning, their car broke down. So it's 5 p.m, they're miles from nowhere. The husband starts tinkering with the engine, and she walks over the hill to see if there's anything in the area that, basically could help them. So she sees a sign on a tree, and it said with an arrow saying sunrise cabins this way. So she goes up there. She finds a holiday area. I think it's got caravans and a motel or something, and some tents that have been set up. So she books a tent. They camp there for the night, basically. She's there laying in the tent, looking out the flap of the tent into the night sky, thinking how beautiful it was. And suddenly she sees a very bright light and thinks it looks like the same light or star she saw previously in the year. Anyway, she's watching it. It's getting closer. And then she sees boomerang-shaped objects coming out of this light. And her last thought, she said, was, oh, my God, if these are what I think they are, then UFOs are real because I'm wide awake and I'm really seeing this. Anyway, I could just put myself in her situation. I can imagine, what she was going through. But anyway, she describes everything then changing. She's suddenly no longer in the tent. She has no idea where or how she got there. And she didn't care either. She had absolutely no fear, which is really odd. But that's what happens in some of these cases, these close encounter cases. Fear just seems to disappear. She finds herself standing on a deserted street that appeared to be L-shaped. There were no people or cars on this road. It was night. She's standing under a lamppost, and there's another lamppost on the other side of the road. Anyway, at the corner of the street, there appears to be a country and western tavern with lots of people. and somehow she knew her husband was in there as well. So at this stage, it seems to me, while she's telling me her story, that some sort of scenario has been set up for her to be placed there. Because remember, she's in the outback here, okay? There's nothing else around. So anyway...
except for the Min lights.
Well, yes, there could be some of those. Yes, absolutely. But anyway, the street's totally deserted, and she knew that she was waiting for someone. She's feeling very excited, almost ecstatic. And then a silver vehicle, like a car, comes towards her from the sky, and it lands in front of her. And she describes it as having no wheels, doors, or roof. It seems to hover just slightly off the ground. And in the vehicle were four very human-like beings, and they were all male, and one of them was holding a small child. And they were all dressed the same, including the child, in silvery, skin-tight, one-piece suits, and even the boots they had on seemed to be part of the suit. Anyway, so they've come to reassure her, to show her this child who is, they alleged, her unborn son. And she, they wanted her to hold it, or she wanted to hold it, can't quite remember now, but first she has to undergo this detoxification process. So one of them has like a backpack on it, and it has a spray nozzle, and it sprays her down, and she's immediately wet, and then she's immediately all dry. So there's some sort of anti-contamination purification process that she's gone through. And anyway, so she's holding the child. She feels connected to it. Meanwhile, her husband walks past and says, look, sweetheart, this is our son. Isn't he beautiful? But he just keeps on walking past her as if he's in a daze. Anyway, so they brought the child to her to reassure her that the child that she's going to have is going to be okay, not to worry, there's nothing wrong with her. And that goes on for a while. Anyway, eventually the child's given back to the beings, and she watches the silvery vehicle go back up into the sky and disappear over the treetops. Anyway, the next thing, she's back in the tent, seeing all the boomerang-shaped objects going back into the bright light. When the last one entered, a very loud noise started, and her husband sat up in bed and was pulling at her to get up and have a look at this herd of wild horses that he's imagined stampeding through the camping area. But she just says she feels paralyzed. She couldn't move a muscle, and before the noise, but the noise just keeps going until eventually she drags herself up to see what was going on, only to hear her husband say, "Oh, too late, you missed it, go back to sleep," which she instantly did. But anyway, finally getting to the missing pregnancy. But I just wanted to give you the background of that particular case. The next morning, she has a nagging feeling that something had happened through the night, but she couldn't remember what. So she put it down to one of those dreams that you have but you can't remember. Goes and has a shower, returns to her husband, and he says, "Did you hear the racket those horses made last night when they came stampeding through here?" Of course, that triggers her memory, and she immediately remembers everything that happened the night before. Now, 5 days after that experience, she miscarries, has a miscarriage while she's still on the holidays, but the doctors couldn't find a fetus, so they assumed she had lost it before arriving at the hospital. Now, it took nearly 4 hours to get to the hospital from where they were, so if she'd lost anything, it would have been in the car, which it wasn't. Anyway, when she told them she was 9 weeks pregnant by then, they told her she must be mistaken, because the doctor said, "You've gone through an actual labour, and with the amount of afterbirth present, she would have had to be no less than 14 weeks pregnant," which she found impossible to believe. So 2 months after that miscarriage, she falls pregnant again, gives birth to a son, and who is the exact duplicate from her description of the child that she had held during that close encounter.
Wow, that's very strange, but not dissimilar to other cases that we've investigated. We have a lady here, Krista Tilton, who has had missing fetuses. We wrote her story up along with many others in our Sextraterrestrials book, which has got like 350 pages of data on similar episodes like this. So something strange is going on. I mean, it seems, it's hard to believe that there could be crossbreeding like that. I mean, they would have to be very, very closely related to us, I would think, in order to produce the children.
Well, to be honest, I could say, or a skeptic could say, well, that's an assumption, because we actually don't really know what they're doing. I mean, we have people who report close encounters who say that they're part of a breeding program, and I get that, and I can see why they would interpret the information like that. And you've got to remember that when people have these reports and they tell us, I always say that some of these aliens are master mental manipulators, and they can put information.
They are indeed.
Yep. They can put information into our mind and make us think and feel anything in some cases. So, it's, maybe that's going on. Maybe there's something else. I really don't know. I just can't say 100% either way.
Mm-hmm. Now, you talk about a case of a missing time of a police trainee?
Yes, I do.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Now, this was, let me see. This was with a gentleman that we interviewed late last year. And this is, again, going back some years. All these cases that are really cases that are full of detail, rich with detail, these go back many years. We're not getting those cases these days, right? But so this occurred in 1976, and he was at the Greenbank military base, and that's not too far from where I am, actually, probably about a 15-minute drive. Anyway, in 1976, he was a trainee police officer training in bush rescue at the Greenbank area, and it's a live training facility. It's about 46 square kilometres for the Australian Defence Force, okay? And it's located 25 kilometres south of Brisbane. Anyway, the trainees at the time, they were being trained by an Army Reserve officer, and they were given a grid map and told they had to find their way to another grid in a certain time. The maximum time was 45 minutes that people had done it in. Most people did it in 30. Anyway, the group was divided into 3 squads, and this guy, I'll call his name Steve, his squad made it in the allotted time, but another squad got completely lost. And even though they had a map and compasses, they went missing for 3 hours, long enough to trigger a search for them. Now, Steve was personally involved in the search, driving in all-terrain vehicles looking for the group. And when they eventually turned up, they were told that they'd been missing for 3 hours. And the squad said, oh, come on, we've been gone for 25 minutes. Because they thought they'd actually beaten everybody. Anyway, when they were asked what they were doing, they replied, nothing out of the ordinary, just going from point A to point B like we were instructed. When they asked what terrain they covered, they pointed them out, but the other squads had looked for them in those spots, but they couldn't find anyone. So they'd already covered that area. Anyway, as a result, that squad was subsequently spirited away, and the other squad members weren't allowed to speak to them for a while. And eventually they did, but the missing squad gave what Steve interpreted, he said, sounded like scripted replies, keeping to their story. He said, you can tell when people are telling you something that they've been told to tell you. Anyway, when the squad members were leaving the camp, unidentifiable people turned up wearing suits. So they didn't know what that was about. But anyway, some years later in 1985, Steve was in the Army Reserve and again on the same base. And they had a lot of malfunctioning equipment, anything from rifles to radios. And his own rifle would jam, even though he was really meticulous with it, cleaning it, stripping it down all the time, as everyone had to do. It was an SLR rifle. They all had those, which are an extremely reliable rifle. A couple of other people had the same problem with their rifles. Curiously, the radio operator would report his radio would just stop working. But as soon as he came out of the operation, his radio would function fully. The battery wasn't drained. Its functionality was just suspended. And the same occurred with vehicles where they would just die and then they would start again. And at times, Stephen said he had trouble with his own concentration, and other people did too. They were talking about that. And there was a certain no-go area which was deep in the base where all this would occur. So there's some really strange things going on there, but a group of people in the earlier part, they had that 3 hours of missing time.
That is bizarre. Cheryl, we've only got about 3 minutes left in the show, but really quick, Jeremy from the Las Vegas UFO Hunters wants to know if the number or frequency of UFO sightings, have they increased or decreased since the recent fires in Australia?
Decreased, but they were low before that. There's not been a lot happening here for quite some years. It's just gone into that cycle, that lull cycle, which does happen with this phenomenon from time to time. But there has been something. There were a couple of reports came in where someone had sent some video footage in where we thought there could be some sort of genuine UFO. That was again north of Brisbane. But generally, everything's pretty quiet.
All right. Well, why don't you let our audience know really quick where they can find out more about you, where websites, things like that. Sure.
Okay. Well, our website is UFO Research Queensland. But for anyone who's interested in, particularly in the Tully case, you can go to our YouTube channel. Just search for UFO Research Queensland YouTube channel. And you'll find a recording of Albert Panisi talking at our 50th anniversary conference in 2006, talking all about the Tully case there too. We've also got a Facebook page, again UFO Research Queensland. You can go on there and that's where I post all any sort of news and Australian news and sightings, and I stick just to Australian material on there. So anyone who wants to know what's happening in this part of the world, they can jump on there and have a look.
Well, you also have a very readable magazine.
Yes, we do. Yes, UFO Encounter. That comes out twice.
It's one of the best. Very easy to read, and it's not printed on a gaudy yellow background with purple type and stuff like that. very, very, very easy to read and very enjoyable, and some very, very important articles. Anyway, it's been a pleasure to talk with you again, and I will follow up in a couple of months and see what's cooking. And in the meantime, don't forget our YouTube channel, Mr. UFO Secret File. And this week, Tim, what book did we release? The Paul Villa story.
That's right, Secret UFO Contacts of Paul Villa on Amazon right now.
All color, every page.
Good night, all. Thanks, Cheryl.
Thank you.
Pleasant dreams. Yes, thank you.
You've been listening to Exploring the Bizarre with hosts Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz. They're taking back the night by jetting non-stop across the cosmos in search of the truly bizarre and totally unexplained, with you as their co-pilot. Thursday nights at 7 p.m. Pacific, 10 p.m. Eastern, on the KCOR Digital Radio Network. For more information on Exploring the Bizarre and hosts Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz, check out their KCOR Digital Radio Network page. Follow their YouTube channel at MRUFO 1100. Exploring the Bizarre.